At exactly 8:17 this morning, something happened that no one can explain. Not a war, not a blackout, not a cyber attack. People disappeared. At first, it didn't make sense. In Los Angeles, traffic cameras captured cars slowly drifting off the road, rolling into each other, not because of speed, but because the drivers were gone. In Dallas, a woman was on a phone call with her sister. Mid-sentence, she stopped talking, not because the call dropped, but because she was no longer there. In New York, a subway train pulled into the station with no conductor inside. Passengers sat in confusion, looking around, trying to understand what had just happened. There were no explosions, no warning, no sound, just absence. And then something happened that made it impossible to ignore. A plane lost altitude over Chicago. Not because of engine failure, because the pilot was gone. Emergency lines flooded instantly. Thousands of calls at the same time. People screaming, crying, asking the same question. Where did they go? Within minutes, videos started appearing online. People searching for their families, calling names that no one answered. Homes left open. Phones still charging. Clothes still warm. But the people who wore them were gone. And then something even stranger happened. The disappearances weren't random. At first, people thought it was a coincidence. Maybe a mass abduction. Maybe some kind of unknown attack. But as more reports came in, a pattern began to form. Entire families were missing, but not all of them. In some homes, one person was gone while everyone else remained. A husband gone, a wife still there, a child gone, parents still searching. And then the question changed. It was no longer what is happening. It became, why them? Because once you start asking that question, you begin to notice something you can't ignore. The people who disappeared had something in common. Not their age, not their income, not their location, their beliefs. I didn't believe it at first. I told myself it was panic, people trying to find patterns in chaos. But then I checked my phone. 23 missed calls, all from one person, my sister. I called her back immediately. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then I heard something strange. Her phone wasn't ringing in my ear anymore. It was ringing behind me. I turned around. Her apartment door was slightly open. I walked inside slowly. Hello? No answer. The TV was on, lights still on, coffee still warm on the table. Her phone was on the floor, but she wasn't there. That was the moment everything changed, because it wasn't just the news anymore. It was personal. I started calling everyone I knew, friends, family, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some picked up, some didn't, and the ones who didn't were the ones who used to talk about something I never took seriously. They used to say things like, "You need to be ready." No one knows the day or hour. It will happen when people least expect it. I remember laughing. I remember thinking it wasn't real. But standing there in an empty apartment, holding a phone that had no one left to answer, I realized something that sent a chill through my entire body. What if they were right? Because if they were right, then this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was an event. An event that had been described thousands of years ago. But this is where it gets uncomfortable, because what if the occurrence didn't happen the way people were told? What if the people who disappeared weren't the only ones who were supposed to go? At first, people didn't want to believe it. Even after everything, most people searched for another explanation. Governments called it an unidentified global event. Scientists spoke about unknown phenomena. But deep down, people knew what this was because the idea had always been there, ignored, dismissed, delayed. And now it wasn't theory anymore. It was reality. The world stopped asking what happened and started asking what comes next. Because confusion doesn't last forever. Eventually, people need direction, and that's exactly what began to happen. Broadcasts became consistent. Messages became unified. Stay calm. Remain where you are. Further instructions are coming. At first, people resisted, but fear has a way of changing that. Because fear doesn't just make people panic, it makes them listen. The longer the uncertainty continued, the more people were willing to accept something they normally wouldn't. Centralized control. It didn't happen all at once. It started small. Restrictions, limitations, adjustments. And then the systems people relied on began to fail. Banks slowed down, stores ran out of supplies, processes became unstable. Meanwhile, a new system worked perfectly, fast, seamless, reliable, and people moved toward it. Because when one option becomes difficult and another becomes easy, the choice stops feeling like a choice. And then he appeared, not loudly, not forcefully, calm, measured, or certain. There was something about him, something no one could explain. He never hesitated, never second-guessed, never seemed surprised, almost like he had been waiting for this. He spoke about unity, about rebuilding, about moving forward, and everything he said worked. People trusted him because everything he said worked, and that's exactly what made him dangerous. He didn't demand control. He was given it. The system expanded. Identity became connected. Access became unified. Everything became easier. At first. Then something shifted. A woman stood in a store holding food she couldn't buy. Her payment failed. Her access was denied. Behind her, people watched, not with sympathy, but with distance. Because the system had changed. It didn't feel like choosing a system. It felt like choosing survival. And once you accepted it, you didn't just gain access. You gave something up. Most people didn't notice. Because life improved, faster, easier, better. But not everyone accepted it. Some remembered, some hesitated, some stepped back. And for them, life became harder. A father tried to trade what he had left for food. No system, no access. The person in front of him shook their head, not because they didn't want to help, but because they couldn't. This wasn't chaos anymore. This was control working perfectly. The divide became clear, not between rich and poor, not between strong and weak, but between those inside the system and those outside of it. And once that line was drawn, there was no middle ground, because the system didn't need to force people. It only needed to make life outside of it almost impossible. And that's when everything changed, not suddenly, but completely. The world felt stable, structured, controlled, but underneath, something was building. A shift, a tension, a moment that had been described long before any of this began. And then it happened. The sky changed, not gradually, not naturally. Something broke through, something undeniable, something no one could ignore. This time, no one disappeared. This time, everyone saw. Every screen, every city, every place. At once. No confusion, no debate. Only reality. Everything that had been ignored. Everything that had been delayed. Everything people thought they had time for had already passed. And the truth is, the moment never announces itself. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just happens. And by the time you understand it, you're no longer preparing for it. You're living in what comes after. So if it already happened, would you recognize it? Or would you still be waiting after it's already too late? Days passed, then weeks, and the world didn't collapse. That was the first thing that felt wrong, because everyone expected chaos, panic, riots, total breakdown. But instead, the world adjusted, quietly, systematically, like something behind the scenes was holding it together. At first, people called it recovery, emergency responses, global coordination, stabilization, words that sounded reassuring. But the more I watched, the less it felt like recovery, and the more it felt like replacement. Because things weren't going back to normal, they were becoming something else. Something more controlled, more precise, more intentional. Shortages didn't disappear. They were managed. Movement didn't stop. It was redirected. Information didn't vanish. It was filtered. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, the world people were used to stopped existing. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like it was being rewritten in real time. And that's when I started noticing something I couldn't ignore. The timing. Everything was happening in sequence, not randomly, not unpredictably, but in a way that felt scheduled. Like events weren't just happening, they were unfolding, one after another, exactly when they needed to. And that's when a memory surfaced, something I hadn't thought about in years. My sister's voice, calm, certain. The way she used to say things that made no sense at the time, but stayed with you anyway. There's a period of time the Bible talks about. I remember half listening, scrolling through my phone, nodding like it didn't matter. 7 years, where everything changes. 7 years. Back then, it sounded distant, symbolic, like one of those things people say that you never expect to see. But standing there, watching a world that no longer behaved like it used to, that number didn't feel symbolic anymore. It felt exact, measured, defined, like a countdown that had already started, without anyone realizing it. Because what we were living through didn't feel like a disaster. Disasters are loud, they're chaotic, they don't follow order. This felt ordered, like something had been set in motion a long time ago. And now it was unfolding, step by step, exactly as planned. And the more I paid attention, the more something else started to bother me. Not what was happening, but how familiar it felt. Like I had heard this before, not in detail, not in a way I understood, but enough to recognize it. Fragments of conversations, verses I ignored, warnings I laughed off, about a time when the world wouldn't end immediately, but would enter something else first, a period, a stretch of time, where everything would shift, not just physically, but spiritually, morally, systemically. And the deeper I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Because the Bible never described it as random. It described it as appointed, a set time, a determined period, something that wouldn't start early and wouldn't start late. And for the first time since all of this began, a question formed in my mind that I couldn't push away. What if this wasn't the aftermath? What if this was the beginning? Not the end of something, but the start of something far worse. Because if the timeline was real, if those 7 years weren't symbolic, then what we were seeing now was only the opening phase, the part that feels controlled, manageable, even hopeful, before everything changes, before the shift, before the point, where the world stops pretending to be stable and reveals what it has been becoming all along. And that's when the realization hit me. Slow at first, then all at once. This wasn't random. This wasn't recovery. And this definitely wasn't over. This was structured, measured, timed. And if that was true, then we weren't just living through events. We were moving through a timeline that had been written long before any of this started. And the most unsettling part, it had already begun. At first, things got better. That's what confused everyone, Because after everything that happened, people were expecting the world to fall apart. Not stabilize, but it did, quietly, efficiently, almost perfectly. Conflicts that had been ongoing for years suddenly stopped, not reduced, not negotiated, resolved. Agreements were signed faster than anyone thought possible. Countries that didn't trust each other started cooperating. And for the first time since the disappearances, the world felt like it could breathe again. News anchors stopped sounding panicked. Markets stabilized. Supply chains started working again. Food became available. Systems became reliable. Life started to feel normal. And that's what made it dangerous. Because nothing about what had just happened should have been this easy to fix. But no one wanted to question it. Because relief is powerful. Relief makes you stop asking questions. It makes you accept things you normally wouldn't. And at the center of all of it was him. But he didn't arrive like a leader. He didn't declare authority. He didn't force control. By the time most people noticed him, he was already there, speaking, advising, coordinating, everywhere at once, but never in a way that felt overwhelming, just present enough to be trusted. At first, he looked like every other figure trying to help, calm, composed, measured, but there was something different about him, something subtle that most people couldn't explain. He never hesitated. Not once. Every question, he had an answer. Every crisis, he had a solution. And not just ideas, results. Immediate, effective, unquestionable. And that's when people started doing something they hadn't done in a long time. They stopped debating. Because there was nothing left to argue about. Everything he suggested worked. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, his voice became the one people waited for. Not because they were told to listen, but because they wanted to. Because in a world that had just experienced something unexplainable, certainty felt like safety, and he was the only one who seemed certain. But the more I watched him, the more something didn't sit right with me. Not because he was wrong, because he was never wrong. Not once. And that's not normal. No one is always right. No one predicts everything correctly. No one solves every problem without failure. But he did. Consistently. And people didn't just trust him. They depended on him. Because the systems he helped build didn't just fix problems. They prevented them. Decisions became faster. Processes became smoother. Outcomes became predictable. Too predictable. Like variables had been removed, like uncertainty itself was disappearing. And for most people, that felt like progress. But for some, it felt like something else, because there's a difference between peace and control, and the line between the two is harder to see than people think. At first, nothing was required. Everything was optional. People chose to follow, chose to adopt, chose to trust. And that's what made it so effective, because it never felt forced. It felt earned. And that's when I remembered something else. Something I wish I had taken more seriously when I heard it. A warning about a time when peace would come first. Not real peace, but something that looks like it. Something convincing enough to make people believe everything is under control. Right before everything changes, and standing there, watching a world that had somehow become more stable than before the disappearances, I felt something I couldn't explain. Not fear, not panic. Something quieter, something deeper. A question. If everything is working this well, why does it feel like something is about to go wrong? Because deep down, I think people could sense it. Not consciously, not clearly, but enough to feel it. That this wasn't the end of the crisis. This was the calm before something else, something bigger, something the world wasn't ready for. And the most unsettling part, no one wanted to say it out loud, because saying it would mean admitting something no one was ready to face, that this peace might not be what it seems. And then it changed. Not gradually, not in a way you could prepare for. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, the kind of change you only recognize after it's already happened. The broadcasts felt different. Same voice, same message, but something underneath it was no longer the same. The tone shifted from reassurance to authority, from guidance to instruction. At first, people ignored it because everything was still working, systems were still stable, life was still easier than before. But then the adjustments started, small ones, the kind that feel reasonable, necessary, temporary, new regulations, updated requirements, revised access protocols, nothing extreme, nothing alarming, just enough to make things more secure. And most people accepted it, because after everything that had happened, security felt more important than freedom. But then something happened that no one could ignore. A broadcast, global, synchronized, every screen, every device, at the same time. He appeared, not as a coordinator anymore, not as a voice in the background, but at the center, direct, unfiltered, and for the first time, he didn't sound like someone offering solutions. He sounded like someone declaring them. There was no hesitation, no discussion, no alternatives, just certainty. Absolute. And that's when something shifted inside the room I was standing in. People weren't just listening anymore. They were absorbing it, like questioning it didn't even cross their minds. And I felt it too, that pull, that pressure, not physical, something else, something harder to explain, like the atmosphere itself had changed, like resistance was becoming difficult. And that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some people leaned in, nodding, agreeing, almost relieved, but others stepped back, confused, uneasy, like something inside them was warning them, even if they didn't understand why. And the divide started right there. Quiet, invisible, but real. Because from that moment on, things stopped being optional, not immediately, but progressively. Access started depending on compliance. Movement started depending on approval. Participation started depending on alignment. And suddenly, the systems that once made life easier became the systems that determined whether you could live normally at all. And that's when I remembered something I wish I could forget. A warning. Not about chaos, not about destruction, but about a moment, a specific moment, when everything appears stable and then shifts completely. A line being crossed, a point of no return, and standing there, watching people accept something they didn't even fully understand, I realized something that hit harder than everything that came before. This wasn't recovery, this wasn't leadership, and this definitely wasn't temporary. This was control, fully revealed. And the worst part, most people didn't see it that way, because it didn't feel like oppression. It felt like order, it felt like safety, it felt like progress, and that's why it worked. Because the most effective control doesn't feel like control at all. It feels like something you chose, and by the time people started questioning it, it wasn't a system you could step away from anymore. It was a system you were already inside, and leaving it was no longer simple. It came with consequences, real ones, immediate ones, and for the first time since all of this began, fear returned. Not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, focused, directed. Because now, it wasn't about surviving the event anymore. It was about surviving the system that came after it. And deep down, even if people couldn't explain it, they could feel it. Something had shifted, irreversibly, and whatever came next wasn't going to look like peace anymore. It didn't arrive the way people expected. That's what made it so easy to accept. There was no announcement, no warning, no moment where the world stopped and said, "This is it." It came quietly, introduced as an upgrade, a solution to everything that had been breaking behind the scenes, a new system, unified, secure, efficient. At first, it sounded like convenience. No more delays, no more identity theft, no more failed transactions. Everything connected, everything verified, everything simplified. People didn't resist it. Why would they? After everything the world had been through, ease felt like relief, and relief feels like safety. So they signed up, not all at once, but steadily, voluntarily, because it worked better than anything before it. Payments were instant, access was seamless, movement became smoother, no friction, no waiting, no uncertainty. And for a while, it felt like the system had finally been fixed. But then something changed. Not the technology, the requirement. At first it was optional, then it became recommended, then it became expected. And before anyone realized it, it became necessary, quietly, without force, without resistance, because by the time people noticed, there was no alternative left. Cash stopped working. Cards became unreliable, old systems phased out, not removed, just unsupported, until using them became almost impossible. And that's when the first real moment happened. A man stood in line at a store, holding food. Nothing unusual, until he tried to pay. His transaction failed. He tried again, failed. He looked confused, then frustrated, then something else. Because it wasn't his balance, it wasn't the system. It was him. He wasn't registered. No mark, no access. The cashier didn't argue, didn't explain, just looked at him, like there was nothing she could do. And the people behind him? They didn't react. No outrage, no sympathy, just silence. Because they understood something he didn't. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about permission, and without it, you couldn't participate. Not in the economy, not in daily life, not in the world that had been rebuilt. And that's when I saw it. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to understand. It wasn't just a system, it was a line people were crossing without realizing what was on the other side. Because once you accepted it, you weren't just verified, you were connected, fully, permanently. Your identity, your access, your ability to function in society, all tied to one thing. And those who refused didn't just struggle, they disappeared from the system. No buying, no selling, no travel, no services, no way to exist inside the structure everyone else depended on. And for the first time, I understood something I had ignored my entire life. A warning that once sounded impossible, that there would come a time when no one could buy or sell unless they had the mark. Not symbolic, not distant, real, practical, enforced through a system so effective it didn't need violence, because survival itself would pressure people into accepting it. And that's when the fear changed. It wasn't about what had already happened. It was about a choice, a real one. Not theoretical, not philosophical. A decision people had to make. Stay outside the system and struggle to survive, or step inside and give up something they couldn't fully explain. Most people didn't hesitate, because hunger doesn't wait for conviction, fear doesn't wait for clarity, and survival has a way of rewriting your beliefs. I'll just do it for now. I don't have a choice. It doesn't mean anything. That's what people said, and maybe they believed it, or maybe they just didn't want to think about what it actually meant. But a few people hesitated. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like something inside them was telling them, this isn't just a system. This is something else, something final. Because once you step into it, there's no stepping back out. And the most unsettling part? The system didn't force anyone. It didn't need to. Because it made the alternative almost impossible. And standing there, watching a world where everything worked perfectly for the people inside the system and not at all for those outside of it, I realized something that felt heavier than everything before it. This wasn't just control. This was separation, permanent, deliberate, unavoidable. And by the time most people understood what was happening, they had already made their choice. The second half didn't feel like the first, not even close. Whatever had been holding things together was gone. At first it was small, things people could ignore, weather patterns shifting, unusual events, systems glitching in ways that didn't make sense anymore. But then it escalated. Fast, not isolated, global, relentless. And for the first time, people stopped calling it coincidence because it didn't feel random. It felt directed, like the world itself was responding to something deeper than anything people could explain. And the stability everyone had trusted started to crack. Not completely, just enough to expose what was underneath it. Fear, real fear, not panic, not confusion, but the kind of fear that settles in your chest and doesn't leave. Because now, people weren't just trying to survive events, they were trying to survive pressure. Constant, unavoidable. And the pressure wasn't just physical, it was everywhere. In decisions, in conversations, in silence. Because by now the divide was complete. Not hidden, not subtle, clear. Those inside the system, and those outside of it. And the ones outside? They became visible. Not because they wanted to be, but because they had no way to blend in anymore. No access, no participation, no protection. And that's when something changed in the way people looked at them. At first, it was confusion, then frustration, then something else. Distance. Like they didn't belong anymore. Like they had chosen to separate themselves, even when that wasn't the full truth. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, they became the problem. Not the system, not the pressure, them. Because in a world where everything depended on alignment, anyone who refused it felt like a disruption. And disruptions don't last long in systems like that. So life outside the system became harder. Not all at once, but steadily. Food became harder to find. Safe places became harder to reach. Trust became harder to give. Because even helping someone outside the system came with risk. Real risk. And people knew it. So they stopped helping. Not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid. And fear has a way of silencing compassion. And that's when the real weight of the choice became clear. Because this wasn't about belief anymore. It was about endurance. How long could someone hold on when everything around them was pushing them to give in? And some did, quietly. After days, weeks, months, people who once said never started saying, I can't do this anymore. And no one blamed them, because survival has limits. And when you reach those limits, conviction becomes harder to hold. But not everyone gave in. Some stayed, not loudly, not trying to prove anything, just holding on, even when it cost them everything. And that's what made it harder to watch, because they weren't resisting out of pride or rebellion. They were holding on to something they believed mattered more than survival. And in a world that had redefined everything, that kind of belief didn't make sense anymore. It wasn't logical, it wasn't practical, it wasn't safe, but it was real. And that's when I started noticing something else, something I couldn't ignore. The more pressure increased, the more the system revealed itself, not just as control, but as something that demanded loyalty, not partial, not temporary, complete, because it wasn't enough to exist inside it anymore. You had to belong to it, fully, and anyone who didn't stood out, more and more, until hiding wasn't possible, and the world that once felt structured started to feel heavy, tense, like something was building beneath the surface, something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet, but was getting closer. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood something that changed everything. This wasn't just a period of time, it was a test. Not announced, not explained, but undeniable. A line had been drawn, and now everyone was on one side of it, whether they realized it or not. And the most unsettling part? There was no middle ground anymore. No neutral position, no safe distance, because doing nothing was still a choice, and every choice had a consequence. And as the days went on, and the pressure didn't stop, and the system didn't loosen, and the divide didn't fade, one thing became clear. Whatever came next wasn't going to be subtle. And then, something happened that no one was prepared for. At first, it sounded like rumors, stories spreading online, people dismissing them, calling them fake, edited, impossible, because what they were saying didn't make sense. They said people were trying to escape, not the system, not the pressure, the suffering. They said some people had reached a point where they couldn't take it anymore, and they tried to end it. But something wasn't right. Videos started appearing, taken down quickly, re-uploaded, blurred, hard to watch. A man standing in a bathroom, holding something in his hand, shaking, crying. Then silence, and then he was still there, alive, not unharmed, but not gone. Another clip, someone collapsing after doing the same thing. People screaming, trying to help. But the outcome wasn't what anyone expected. Hospitals started reporting it quietly at first, then more openly. Cases that didn't make sense. People who should have died weren't dying. Doctors couldn't explain it. Not medically, not scientifically, nothing added up. And that's when the fear changed again, because this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about escape. And suddenly, there wasn't one. People started saying it out loud, carefully, almost in disbelief. It's like death isn't available. And the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore, because it wasn't isolated, it wasn't rare, it was consistent. And that's when something I had heard before, something I never understood at the time, came back to me. A line, simple, but impossible to forget once you see it happen. That there would come a time when people would seek death and not find it, when they would desire to escape and wouldn't be able to. And standing there, watching a world where suffering was increasing, pressure was constant, and even the idea of escape was taken away, I felt something deeper than fear, something heavier, because this wasn't just pain anymore. This was confinement, not just in a system, but in reality itself. And for the first time, people realized something they hadn't considered before. This wasn't just about control. This wasn't just about survival. This was something far more final. Because when even death is no longer an option, you're not just living through something, you're trapped inside it. And then everything stopped. Not gradually, not like systems shutting down. Instantly, the noise, gone. No broadcasts, no alerts, no movement, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels like something is about to happen. And for a moment, no one moved. Because whatever had been building, whatever had been increasing, whatever had made the world feel heavy for so long, had suddenly paused, like everything was waiting. And then, the sky changed. Not like a storm, not like clouds forming. This was different. It didn't move. It opened, not wide, not violently, but enough to make something clear. This wasn't natural. And for the first time since all of this began, everyone saw the same thing. At the same time, no delays, no filters, no explanations. Every screen, every city, every person, looking up, or looking at something they couldn't look away from. Because this wasn't something you could ignore. It wasn't something you could explain. It was something you were witnessing, directly. And whatever it was, it didn't arrive quietly. But it also didn't feel chaotic. It felt controlled, intentional, like this moment had been set, long before anyone alive had ever existed. And then it became undeniable. This wasn't another event. This wasn't another shift. This wasn't something the world could adapt to. This was something the world had been moving toward this entire time. And suddenly, everything people had heard before, everything they had dismissed, everything they thought they had time to figure out, collapsed into one realization. It was real, not partially, not symbolically, completely. And there was no debate anymore, because this wasn't belief, this was sight. And the strange thing was, no one was confused, no one was asking questions, because deep down, people already knew what this was. They just never thought they would see it. And the weight of that realization hit all at once. Not fear, not panic, something deeper, something final. Because in that moment, there was no more delay, no more time to think, no more time to prepare. Whatever choices had been made were already made. And whatever side you were on, you were already there. And for the first time, the system didn't matter. Control didn't matter. Access didn't matter. Because everything that once felt powerful felt small, irrelevant, temporary, and something else, something greater than everything that had come before, had taken its place. And the most unsettling part, it didn't feel unexpected. It felt overdue, like something that had been held back was finally released. And standing there, watching something no one could deny, I understood something I wish I had understood earlier. The moment doesn't feel real when you hear about it. It doesn't feel urgent when you think you still have time. It only becomes real when you're already inside it, when the waiting is over, when the warnings make sense, when everything you thought you had control over is no longer yours to decide. And the truth is, by the time most people recognize the moment, they're no longer preparing for it. They're standing in it. And the question they thought they had time to answer is already behind them. So if everything you just saw wasn't a story, but a glimpse of something real, something that could begin without warning, without announcement, without giving you time to adjust, would you recognize it? Or would you do what most people did? Wait, explain it away, Assume there's still time until the moment passes and you realize you weren't waiting for it. You missed it. If it happened tonight, would you be ready? If this made you think, share it with someone who needs to see this. Prepare them for the rapture so they don't miss it. Good night, and God bless you.